everyone. This is a tour of native New York with Evan Pritchard. My name is Asher Pact. I'm Director of Environmental Programs at Clarkson University's Beacon Institute for Rivers and Estuaries. I am here at the Water Ecology Center in Dennings Point State Park with Patty Devine, my fellow staff member at Beacon Institute, and with Evan Pritchard, founder of Center for Algonquin Culture. Before we begin, I want to let everyone know that the Water Ecology Center here, the WEC, is open now every weekend from 10 to 2. Evan's exhibit, Mapping Native New York, is on view here through March 27th. And we're about a half-mile walk from the gate here at Dennings Ave parking lot. Patty is here on Saturdays, and she can provide more information and support for accessibility as needed. Before coming, just check our website for any holidays or closings. That's clarkson.edu/beacon. Also, please mark your calendars for the second weekend in April when we'll have a new exhibit, The Hudson at Beacon. It will have 18 exhibits appropriate for all ages about the ecology and history of the area, and we look forward to showing that as well. But please do come while Evan's exhibit is still up through the 27th, and we hope to hang elements of the exhibit outside after that as well. So with that, please let me introduce Evan Pritchard, founder of Center for Algonquin Culture.
Well, thank you, Asher. It's great to be here. It's great to be sitting in front of this map. And I would like to open with an improvised flute solo, which is how in the old days, back in the day, they would often begin gathering and introducing newcomers. And now, as to our kind of ceremonial opening, I'd like to do a welcome song and find my drum here. This is my moose drum. I'm actually descendant of Mi'kmaq people from the Maritimes, and we have a lot of moose part of our culture, so I'm going to do a moose drum. I'm going to sing the Yue Haya, or the welcome song. Yue Haya, hey, Yue Haya, Yue Haya, hey, Yue Haya, We Haya, hey, ya, We Haya, hey, yo, Yue Haya, We Haya, yo, we. The first verse is sung to the east to honor the sun, and we turn clockwise to the south, direction of the birds. Yue Haya, hey, Yue Haya, Yue Haya, hey, Yue Haya, We Haya, hey, yo, yo, We Haya, hey, yo, Yue Haya, We Haya, yo, we. And then we turn to the west, and we would sing the song to honor the west, and honor the grandmothers and grandfathers of the west. And the west is the direction of water, and we'll be talking about water today. Yue Haya, hey, Yue Haya, Yue Haya, hey, Yue Haya, We Haya, hey, yo, yo, We Haya, hey, yo, Yue Haya, We Haya, yo, we. And then finally to the north, the direction of the four-leggeds and of the great bear of the north. Yue Haya, hey, Yue Haya, Yue Haya, hey, Yue Haya, We Haya, hey, yo, yo, We Haya, hey, yo, Yue Haya, We Haya, yo, we. Tahoe. Tahoe. And while we are orienting ourselves, I've been requested a journey song. And again, I'm just, briefly bringing us all together here. But there is a journey song that I thought of. It's actually a canoe song. Alabatuk. is like way out on the ocean. So it's a song you would sing when you're way out in the ocean, you're coming into shore, and the Mi'kmaq people on the shore, and they sing to each other as the landing occurred. That's the Birch Park Canoe. Alabatu, Alabatu, Wesquijima DJ, Wesquijima DJ, oh, Wampum well, Wesquijima DJ, must be every tongue. Wesquijima DJ, must be every tongue. Now that's usually done with the drum, but today I thought I'd do a little guitar and kind of make it sound a little bit like a folk song. So welcome, and welcome to the Institute for Rivers and Estuaries. And as he said, I'm Evan Pritchard, or in my language, Abakbahamij, which means chipmunk.
Thank you, Evan, for that welcome. So now we were going to begin the first of 4 parts of Evan's presentation, a tour of native New York. This is a trip through Algonquin Civilization in the time just before European contact and even back to ancient times. And this also doubles as an intimate gallery walk of Evan's current exhibit here at the Institute, Mapping Native New York.
Somewhere in the 80s, I started really wondering, what is an Algonquin? So I went through Webster's dictionary and I looked up every tribe that I knew, every name, and saw what it said to be curious which ones were listed as Algonquin. It turns out like 84 of the ones I knew listed as Algonquin. And so I started to make maps of it, and I made a map like this. This is my first real big Native American map, and it was just kind of for my own use, right? And then I wrote a book called No Word for Time, and published by Council then of Tulsa, and they put it in the book. And it's not a usual map. You don't see maps like this. For some reason, people don't tend to want to say, publicize the fact that all these Algonquins are all related in one nation that was pretty much united about several thousand years ago. But here they are, and they're all still there. They're people who are, you could call them stragglers, or people who have held on to the land of these regions, but these nations are no longer in their current condition. But this book has been in the store since 1997, and still doing well. So this has gotten a lot of play. So that's kind of how I got started. But then I had actually a Lyme disease, and I was losing my memory. And so I wanted to write everything down that I knew about our local people around New York. And so I ended up writing a book called Native New Yorkers, and I called the same publisher, and I said, would you be interested in publishing a book called Native New Yorkers? He said, yes. I said, do you care what's in it? No, it's just a book like with that title, it's got to do well. So I sent him 1,000 pages, and he said, well, it's great, but it's too big. We only need 500 pages. And I said, well, how do you do that? He says, you cut out every other word. And he was quite serious. And so we cut out every other word. Anyway, it's a good editing process. And so then you get this 500-page book, Native New Yorkers. And I used the typeface from New Yorker magazine as a joke, right? Little did I know I would soon be lecturing and sharing the podium with the president of New Yorker magazine. And he commented, oh, I see you stole our typeface. I see you stole our island, I said. And he went, oh, okay, touche. And then we were friends. But anyway, that's a New Yorker typeface. Well, in one of my most recent maps, I went back to those 3 maps that I did, redid them, completely revisioning them, right, with lots of detail. And so I did this, mainly this is the Long Island that I did, which is very similar to the one in Native New Yorkers, only I actually talked to the elders of various tribes. I talked to Raimundo Rodriguez of Nissecogs and Harry Wallace of the Unkichags, and Tecumseh Caesar of the Matinacock, and like trying to get boundaries right. But also I went to all the towns on a map, not in person, because this was during COVID. But I went and looked at the language of the various little towns to decide if they were Nissecock or Setauket or Setauket or Unkichak. And so I was able to work out things like this, that little shape there, trying to figure out exactly where these lines are. So I felt like it was finally got it. So that was one of the features. So this is one of the most recent maps I did. And this one I did at the request of a group called IBEX, who is kind of a revolutionary school or program for children who want to really learn something different. And it's run by Heather Henson, who is an artist and a radical, I think, children's educator, outdoor educator. And she also is the daughter and assistant puppeteer to her father, Jim Henson. And so she was very, very helpful in funding some of it. So I got to talk to more Native people about these details. So this is the Mannahatawak map. And so each color represents a kind of a dialect or language in the area. And so just to go over that a bit, Long Island itself has become a crazy quilt of dialects, which is fun, and there's an old story about the 13 tribes of Long Island. Well, you Native New Yorkers, I mapped that out and I said, well, you could say that because there's some tribes that say there maybe there's 16 major tribes, but 3 of them could really fit in with others. And so, you have this orange color here is basically the Minisink dialect, the Munsee, Minisink Munsee, and the yellow is the Esopus Munsee dialect, and the Ramapo is green, and that's also Munsee, and this pink is Wappingers, which is really related to Quiripi, related to this area here, the Wongunks are an ancient tribe. I couldn't really show that, but that color represents that transition. And so this is the whole area here, Matinacock, and Massapequa. There's like the water in the way, but they were on boats, so it doesn't matter. So you have this whole dialect, which they call Reneu, which just means it's Lenape with the R. And then this area is green, that I said, looking at this dialect, it seems to be an awful like these. And in fact, I found, and again, Raimundo Rodriguez, who just passed away in November, was a very knowledgeable source, and he said their oral tradition for his Nissecock people was that they came over from Connecticut on boats and took this territory, and it used to be Matinacock, but they've been there since around the time of first contact, Henry Hudson. And then the Korchak is related to the Pequot, Montaukett, Pequot, again, that's since Henry Hudson. And the Shinnecock, according to what I've seen, and I looked at their language list, and it does look like their language is very much like Munsee. Esopus Munsee, that's my opinion. And, it's pretty close. And they're very ancient people, so it's like carryover. So that's just a little bit about this map. And the thing is that it has a grid, but it's not a solar grid. If you line up all the letters with all the numbers, you get grids. So this would be A1, B1, C1, and then A1, A2, A3. And each of these are 20 miles square on each side. So then I wrote a book called Mapping Mannahatawak, and in the book I describe everything within that 20-mile grid, so you can kind of reference it like an encyclopedia. So it was like a map plus an encyclopedia that goes with it. And without that, you don't get the whole effect. Okay, so this story begins at the Strawberry Festival of the Clearwater Organization in Beacon. And I was wandering around and trying to find a place in line for strawberry, which never happened because people were lined up for miles. And so I saw Steve stand, and he had a little stand, and he had this big map of the Hudson River watershed. And I'd never seen one before. And I watched him and I said, Steve, what the heck is that? And he said, well, that's the Hudson River watershed. And I was like, okay, this is a while ago. I said, oh, what's a watershed again? You know, because this is a while ago. And he said, well, you know, the Hudson River, all these different rivers flow in. And, you know, that depends on the shape of the land, but then that becomes your watershed for the whole Hudson Valley, and it's very large. And I said, well, it's funny looking, because his was all green, right? Because it's just showing all the land. And it was this shape, I looked at this shape, I said, that's a funny shape. And he said, yes, Pete Seeger said it looked like a dancing green ghost. And as soon as he said that, I saw it. I saw the dancing ghost. I don't know if you can see the ghost, but he's dancing on one leg, and this is his sneaker, and this is his very colorful leg, and then this is his other leg. He's wearing pantaloons, I guess, and this is his waist, and then part of his arms go this way, part of his arm goes that way, and of course he's a ghost. He doesn't have no head. He's like a headless horseman ghost. But once you see that, you can't unsee the dancing green ghost. And every time, of course, I think of Pete Seeger, because he popularized the concept of a watershed years ago, and how important watersheds are because of the green ghost. He would tell the kids, look, dancing green ghost, that's the watershed. And I got it. That got through to me. And so I thought, well, you know, I bought a copy off of him of the map, and he was selling them to raise money. And I went home and looked at this as, well, what's missing is the Native Americans, and how better to represent them except by showing their territories in different colors. And so it turns out there's a lot of different tribal groups within the Hudson Valley, and I don't know if I counted 30, it's just under 25 or 30 of them. And it turns out that almost all of them name themselves after the tributaries that they live on both sides of. And of course, you know, there's the Mohicanituck, and the Mohicans kind of take that name. And the Mohicans are right up at the top, Central Mohican here. Now the Wappinger is an interesting exception because their river is really called Mawinawasik here. And their name, Wappinger, means people or men of the east. And so the colonists named it Wappinger's Creek after the people. But we never did that because our philosophy is, you know, as Algonquin people, that, hey, we're just passing through here. We're not trying to claim or take all this credit for something we didn't do. So naming, you know, a creek after ourselves just would never happen, would never occur to the people. And so they probably didn't call it Wappinger's Creek, but they did call it Mawinawasik. And again, going back to Helen Wilkinson Reynolds, she had the same complaint. She really understood the mind of the Algonquins. She said, they would never call it Wappinger's Creek. That was a colonist. Because that means men of the East. Makes no sense. So in this case, too, the name of the people really is Mawinawasik. But in order for people to understand and recognize, we put Wappingers. But in almost every case, Matawan and Nakpim and Sinsink and Kitchewan. Kitchewan is the great river. That's what it means, the great tributary. Kitchewan, and it's still called that in some places. Croton is the name today. And so all of these place names, they're all like Mohonk, Wawarsing, Mamakating, Esopus Creek, and Catskill maybe have been the name of the creek. So they're all generally named after their tributaries, and the tributaries go right through their living room because they had boats, you know, so they would just wade across. And what's interesting, in the winter, the creeks would freeze, and then they tie messages to snow snakes or these polished sticks and slide them across the creek, and they'd land on the other side and they pick up the message and then write their own message and slide it back across. I just learned that. So all this actually kind of made sense. And here's, we put Moodna Creek so people recognize, but that's the Waranet Creek. Now this was, like I said, I've been starting to work on the idea of having watershed map to tell all the tribes, but then I didn't do it because it's hard work, you know, who likes work. But then this fellow came along that wanted a map of something, and this was person was George Tuchel, who was associated, I guess, with DEC, and he wanted a map, something, maps, maybe several maps, that would bring alive the local history of the Native people in an environmental way. And said, how would you like a map of the watershed that shows where the different tribes are? We said, yes, let's do it. And there's a different color for each of these, basically, these different subtribes. They're all Algonquin-speaking people. and they all work together in a kind of a harmony, the way that all the waters, the tributaries all run together into the Mohikanituk. Now the Mohikanituk is a beautiful word. Mo means the most. It's a superlative. Hikan is an arm of the sea, which I mentioned before. It's some kind of arm of the sea where the tidal waters ebb and flow, and that's Tuk, actually a river that ebbs and flows. And at Beacon, there's a spot near the Sloop Club where it literally flows both ways at once, where the fresh water's coming down, it's lighter, and the salt water is coming up and it's heavier. So salt water ducks under, but also at the sides, the water rushes up the sides. And so it's going upstream and downstream at the same time at certain times of day and certain seasons, depending on the water levels, depending on the time of day and the tides. Okay? And so they like having this do-it-yourself kind of fossil fuel-free transportation where the tide would take them up and then bring them back.
Welcome back, everyone. Let's now go back live to Evan in the here and now, tying in a deeper perspective on how Native Algonquin people would live and journey through southern New York.
So I want to talk about this tribes and tribes, the first people of the Hudson Estuary. Now, mentioning Dutchess County, which is where the center is here in Beacon, before the arrival of Henry Hudson to our region, that was 1609, the Hudson River was called the Mohikanituk, literally the greatest of estuaries, and the arm of the sea that flows both ways. I've heard Mohikanituk also, different, but also historically accurate. In the eons of time before the arrival of the Europeans, the Algonquins of the Hudson River Valley possessed a keen sense of living in place. They had to, because the details of their daily lives were determined by where they lived and the resources that the place offered. They had to survive off the land. Take water, for example. Virtually every Algonquin lived within about 50 feet of a source of drinking water, because the further you carry water, the heavier and heavier it seems, and the more burden it is to carry. I used to do this experiment with elementary school kids, and then say, well, hold this, is that heavy? And they say, no, that's not heavy, I can carry this. And I said, well, keep carrying it. And I do the class to come back to the kid. Is it heavy now? Oh yeah, it's gotten really heavy. So closer than 50 feet, a home or a village might be subject to floods several times a year. But further away, then you have a daily problem of transporting the water, as it weighs over 8 pounds per gallon. Some Algonquins lived in rock shelters, using an overhang in the rock formation, fashioning covering out of woven weeds and reeds to make a home, and only the rock formations with nearby water were used, whereas other shelters in rocks or caves would only be used for overnight camping. You have to carry the water to them. So water determined where you lived and what you drank. I like to say water was the official beverage of the Algonquin people of New York before there was a New York. And of course, in order to add flavor and enhance the healing qualities of the water that water already possesses, they'd add leaves and roots from certain herbs to this pot, and then they'd boil it and make delicious, very delicious, in some cases, of course, medicinal strength teas. They also had access to honey, perhaps. Some people believe there was honeybees, smaller ones, but in a more limited way than we would today. Now, also, this is the Catskill region. Water was also a principal mode of transportation and used because almost everyone lived near a canoe route or waterway. No fossil fuels were used or needed. If you had lived in the Hudson watershed before 1609, everyone else you knew also lived on the waterway and also on a canoe route, and all were connected by the tributaries of the Hudson. So in those days, a canoe could take you everywhere you needed to go. So birch bark canoes have very little displacement in the water, and they're very, very buoyant. They ride very high in the water, so an expert oarsman could travel by water upstream, high into the mountains, or on small streams that would be deeper in the spring and shallower in the summer. A lot of people today don't see those streams as transportation routes, but in those days, you could navigate them. With a canoe, you can visit your mountain cousins as well as your tidewater cousins. And there's a lot of skill involved. And they had also portages to deal with. The problem with birch bark is that it dissolves over time in salty or brackish water. For travel at sea level, you needed a dugout canoe that was carved out from a tulip tree or a muhul, as they would say in Muncie. And it's a kind of the wood that used in the tulip tree would not rot in the salt water, and is usable for more than a century. The tulip tree and the dugout were called, in the highly metaphoric language of the Muncie, muhul. And so one might ask, would you like to ride in my tulip tree? Or the muhul. And everyone knew that you were referring to the dugout. So yes, I would like to ride in your tulip tree. The muhuls were too heavy to lift, and therefore had to be carved next to the water. But they were shared communally and left about at the shoreline for the next year, the way that we leave shopping carts in the parking lots. Nobody worries about them being stolen. And some colonial records show people finding them in the winter, for example, just lying around with no chains and locks and no worries. Nonetheless, some enterprising young men would often take over a muhul for a while, and they would run a ferry service across the Hudson, like, for example, in Poughkeepsie, where Main Street ends and you have Warriors Park. That would be one of the landings. And they would be there with the customer would be with a staff. They'd be 8 feet long with a white cloth in the end and waving it, saying, "Come get me." And they'd come and they'd exchange furs or jewelry or trinkets or something. And he'd ask for beads or furs for the trouble. And those on foot would come to the bottom of the trail at the landing and wave this white cloth and wait for the prompt ferry service, or maybe not so prompt. Things were time was a different concept then. But anyway, they would come and travel across the estuary. Now, while all the nations of the Hudson River watershed were called river Indians, tribal groups were defined by the watershed of the tributary they lived on. These sub-tribes identified strongly with the tributaries and usually lived on both sides of those flowing waters. And they would name their tribal group after the name of the tributary, and sometimes vice versa. So often the sachem of the tribe would name himself after the tributary or some other body of water. Colonists, for example, talked of a chief Gowanus, which means young pine, in the Brooklyn area, recording that Gowanus Bay was named after him, the chief. However, the word means the small tributary surrounded by pine trees, and so it's clear that he named himself after the water, as did the Kichuan, which means great tributary. Now, as far as what happened to all these people and where did they go, some are hiding in plain sight, as you say, and I like to tell stories about that. For example, I was camping with a friend, and we zipped open the tent, and there was broad daylight. It was quite late in the morning, and my friend said, "Chibungis." I said, "Did you say Chibungis?" And they said, "Yeah, it's Chibungis." I said, "Well, that's when great day in the morning." Yeah, I said, that's like from, nobody said that word in the territory for 400 years. It's Fukchi Wabangis. It means the great morning of the day, and just shortened to Chibungis. I said, "So you say that a lot?" I said, "Yeah, doesn't everyone?" I said, "No, nobody said that for 400 years. Who says it?" "Oh, my dad and his dad and great grandfather said it, grandma said it, brothers said it." So I said, "Your family, you mean?" So maybe they're Muncie. So these surprising things. Another one, I was walking around Manhattan and I saw this fellow, and he looked to me like a Muncie, Delaware, and right in the middle of downtown Manhattan. I walked over and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you of Muncie, Delaware?" And he said, "Yes, I am." I said, "Well, I'm surprised to see you here right in New York City, right on Manhattan. That seems odd to me." He says, No, why should it be odd? This is our island. We named it Manhattan. This is, our homeland. I said, "Well, you're right. Actually," I stand corrected. "You're right. You belong here." But it's just, you don't always think of Muncie Indians, Manhattan Indians still living in Manhattan today. Another story about being here is a friend of mine has an uncle who would take care of the children and he'd come in and says, "Okay, you little wooskies, time to get up." And then it would be time for breakfast. And he said, "Okay, you wooskies, time for breakfast." And she said, "Is that English? Is that an English word?" And so she called me, and I said, "Well, actually, that's a Muncie word, and it means younglings. And it doesn't discriminate based on species. Any species can be a youngling. Who's just calling your children's younglings wooskies?" And so we see these things around. And there's one more, I can see another similar story is that I was at this restaurant place around 209, and I thought this woman looked very much like a Muncie. So I didn't want to say, "Hey, are you a Muncie?" Because that could be very disruptive. So I said, So are you a Wawarsing or a Mamakati?" Because those are two different lines of the Muncie at that location. And we were at the dividing line. She said, "Do I look like a Mamakati? Are you kidding? Don't you think I don't look like a Wawarsing? Of course I'm a Wawarsing. How dare you think I'm a Mamakati? Those people, they're on that side of the line." I said, "Yeah, the line is right around here." She said, "It is right there. And I'm on this side." I said, "Well, you could have moved. Well, you think I would go over to there?" Those people. Anyway, she was kind of pulling my leg. But these divisions haven't been talked about in 200 or 300 years. So I thought it was very interesting that you knew exactly what I was talking about. And that's what I'm talking about, is there are people in plain sight that are continuing this knowledge. And I gave a talk on some of these things in Ellenville once, and there was a whole bunch of Native Americans in the room. And I went over and said, "So where are you from?" I mean, they were dressed nicely, leather and everything. "You're out west of town?" "Oh, no, yeah, we're out west about 3 miles that way. That's where we live." So they're still here somewhere. You never know, because they're in plain sight, hiding. So that's my story.
Thank you, Evan. Okay, so now let's go to part 2 of our tour, which focuses on waterways and is going to begin by bringing us down to New York City.
We have here, like Hell's Gate here, and there's been a lot of trouble in Hell's Gate, right? A lot of, the Slocum drowned, a lot of people drowned, and a lot of trouble happened there. And I did some research, and I found that the recording studio, where Paul Simon recorded Bridge Over Troubled Water for the very first time as a solo number, was right here on Sunkeys Creek, right near Hell's Gate, which is troubled water. So we kind of healed it with song. I thought that was very interesting. So anyway, all this is tricky. There's like shallow rocks, and there's rapids and whirlpools, and so this is Queens. And Matinicot really go for a very long way here, but here you have the Dutch Kill, and Talaka or Crane Creek was here, and also this is Sakineya, the old Sachem's Path. It's quite a long trail. It goes all the way across Queens and Brooklyn. And here's Greenpoint, in case you've ever been there. Wales Creek. Now this is Newtown Creek, which I did a video, it's online, in a kayak, talking about how bad the water was there and don't drink the water. And they called it Maspeth in that state, which means don't drink the water. And so in Algonquin. And then Maspeeches, literally. And there's the Maspeeches village, which is what I'm saying. It means, bad water. And they actually had a peaceful village between Dutch and Algonquins living together. And then, of course, there was smallpox early on, because the Dutch would, carry it and not know it, and then the Algonquins would die from it. So here's the Muscuda. That's what a lot of people think of as the East River by the name Muscuda, which means kind of a duck blind, a place where it's marshy and shallow, and ducks nest there with lots of reeds. That's all in Muscuda. Muscu, it's like swamp. But here, and this is Muscu, but here is the Kikishika River. That's now the Harlem River. And so that all kind of blends together in a way. But see, you have this Canarsie leading, and here's the Tinnicot, which is separate, and not Canarsie, by the way. and this is Rockaway, which is mainly forest land. Now, here, I think this is very interesting. You know, here's Hornsook, and here's this Gowanus Creek, which goes back this way. And here you have Sharankin Village, and here they erected a great standing rock to mark the place where you can cross safely this Kikishika. Well, first of all, Kikishika means the ancient river. Kikishika is literally like, you know, the beloved ancient. And so why is the Kikishika River considered ancient? Well, it must have been where the people, the ancestors originally settled, like thousands of years ago. Could have been after the Ice Age for some reason. And here's New Harlem today. But the Kikishika is the, you know, the beloved, like, ancient Grandma River. So here's this trail, and I have a map at home showing where the waiting place path actually went, and it winds all over Manhattan, actually. Some of it follows Fifth Avenue, some of it follows Third Avenue, but it goes to Harlem River Park today. You know where it is, and that's where the great standing rock was. They took a rock and they just stood it upright on its end and placed it there to mark where it was safe to wade across the Harlem River, which today it's been dredged. You can't do it anymore, of course. But the waiting place at the Great Steady Rock, that's what Sharankin means. I think that's very interesting, because really everything orients itself around this point, because all these different roads all are oriented around being able to cross at Sharankin, at this trading village, which is now Harlem River. In terms of the large maps that we have here, didn't always do large maps. It all started with this one, and this one is on vinyl, which is very practical, and you can roll it up and it doesn't get damaged, and it'll last for a long time. This was my first big map, and so I got hooked on that. And so there's different territories. This is Prattsville here, you see, and here's the Skohari Creek, which is a fascinating creek. This is called the Lower Skohari because it's lower in elevation, of course, going to the Mohawk River. And it has several sources, but right here in the headwaters in Skohari, and down here, sort of near, getting near Saugerties there. So there's different territories. This is Prattsville here, you see, and here's the Skohari Creek, which is a fascinating creek. This is called the Lower Skohari because it's lower in elevation, of course, going to the Mohawk River. And it has several sources, but right here in the headwaters in Skohari, and down here, sort of near, getting near Saugerties there. So this is interesting, Skohari meaning driftwood, as far as I'm convinced. And this is 23, and 23 is a trail, like the Susquehanna Trail, because that's where it goes all the way from Albany to Susquehanna. And so now 23, but that Prattsville is right on that. And that goes, you follow that Bear Creek up to Utsayantha Mountain, which is, people have tried to translate it in Lenape and Muncie, and it doesn't mean anything. There's no way you could possibly make a word out of it. But in Shawnee, it's banging. It's really terrific. Utse is the little people, what they would call Misingways in Lenape, and they're fierce guardians of the woodlands, and they will not let you just cut down trees willy-nilly or hunt all the animals. So Utse and Shawnee are those fairy-like, some people would say, creatures, and Anta is a nation. So here we have Utsayantha Mountain, meaning in Shawnee, the nation of the little people. It's kind of cool. And so they're guardians, so this is a very sacred area. And it's also, here is this, those red dots on these maps mean portage. So you would canoe up to this area on Bear Creek from Skohari, and then you go over the ridge and you jump into the headwaters of the Delaware, and you can go anywhere from there. So extremely strategic portage. So the mini sink, which is this mini sink here, 1746 was when they sold the land for the Hardenberg patent. But the Shawnee were here after 1692 because the mini sink asked them to come to help guard the portage, not to stop anyone from crossing there, but for stopping for any tribe to try to take control of it, because it was critical to the economy such as it was. And so, very important point. So it's the Shawnee, we know it's Shawnee because the Shawnee word, and also we have there's a treaty. And then the Shawnee moved west along the Susquehanna Trail, and you know, I think they just kept going, actually. And so then once we're saying, okay, portages are going on the map, then I found that there's lots of them all over, and that became like a whole nother project to find them. Now here's Bushnellsville Kill, which comes off of the Esopus, and there's a portage that goes to Westkill Creek, and here is Modern Road 42, which kind of fills in for the portage. And then you take that further, and then you end up this little back creek that goes to Skohari again. Skohari goes to the headwaters here, and here's a important portage going to the Plattekill, which goes to the Hudson. And so it was Vernon Benjamin who mentioned that the Seneca occasionally took this route, and I listened, my ears perked up, and again, that kind of started me on this the importance of portages for Native Americans, and therefore for the trappers who followed suit. And here you have, this is the Esopus goes into kind of a C here, and then you have the headwaters of the Neversink, and there's a little portage here, it's only a few hundred feet, but they all connect. And there's more of them if you look closer at the map versus portages, but it's a whole area of what we call the Catskills. But there was also studies I read by Edward Curtin, who's an archaeologist specializing in this area, and he showed how the Iroquoian, you call the Haudenosaunee, but they weren't Longhouse people yet, but moving slowly eastward, and that the Mohicans were all the way to the Susquehanna. This whole area was pretty much Mohican, but then they were until 900, and then they started to be pushed back a little bit, and then this became Mohawk in the 1600s. And then they all ended up here in Skohari Valley, which is quite isolated, with good farmland, and they shared it. The Mohicans and the Mohawks shared it, and Ed Curtin's studies showed that they lived in peace together. But then they got out here to Coxsackie, where there was these flint mines, and there was Tungo, which is a Mohawk village, and then you had a Coxsackie, which is a Mohican village, and guess what? They started to have a little bit of friction over mining the flint, which was necessary for making tools. And then it wasn't really until the Beaver Wars in the early 1600s that it really started to get into a war situation. And that black dot looks like an eclipse. That's where you have to carry your canoe. And the word in French is portage, right? So we have this word in English now. And so you carry there, and then you go over here, and you carry there too, and you get on another creek, This is Middle Creek, and this brings you to the Little Delaware. Once you're at the Little Delaware, you got it made. And Route 28 follows roughly the Little Delaware over to a town called Fraser, and then Delhi, which is a big, meeting place. Oneonta is over here, and Oneonta really is the destination. And so that brings you to the Susquehanna. Once you're at the Susquehanna, that's your major goal. A while back, I was invited to speak to the Westpac group in White Plains by Nada Cotter. And these are all very much environmentally sensitive people and activists. And we talked about the idea of portages. So I did this whole program promoting the modern use of portages in Westchester. Westchester has more portages naturally than almost anywhere in the world, I think. And that's why it was developed so early, because that was the transportation, especially around White Plains, which was called Coropus. And then it turns out, I realized through various references, that the Mohawks were running through with portages through White Plains to get to what were called the Wampum Factories, and there were 3 of them, one on the East River, one at Clarkson's Point, and one at Rye, and then further up. So I started looking, well, how did they get there? Well, it turns out they got there through these back roads, and so I did a whole map for that, for all Westchester, with all these interlocking portages, and then I got a call from the Unitarian Universalists who had a young active youth group. They were doing a lot of outdoor scouting, and they wanted me to do a kind of a service or sermon that wasn't a service or sermon, that was more about these portages, because they were really interested. I said, well, it so happens that you Mount Kisco people are sitting on top, of the mother lode of all portage areas. And they were really interested, so make us a map and give us a talk. So I made this map. I think it came out really well. And I did some things I hadn't tried before, marking the portages not with dots but with a solid red line in this case. You really see these very short portages connecting vast waterways, so that's pretty cool. And then you have the orange triangles or villages, and the watershed lines are in these dotted green lines here. And the Mohawk route that I mentioned, that they're finding their back way to get to these wampum factories, well, here it is, the purple route. Of course, purple is their color, a Mohawk color for the wampum. And so this was really of interest. That's the first thing I was looking for. So Seasqua means muddy. And somebody looked at the C and thought it was a k sound, k, so it's Kisco. But that's wrong. It's Seasqua. It's muddy. Seasqua, that means muddy water, shallow water. And so it goes to the Hudson here, via the Kitchewan or the Croton, and then down, and then is the wampum route. And here, there's a slight portage here, and then this is Wampus Creek, or Wampus River. It just means little stream. And down to the Armonk River, and then to the Bronx River, and then you end up in the East River. So they would take it fairly easily, right? But there's this one portage, and it's in Mount Kisco. Okay? And there's another route they could take for here, and there's this one little portage. It's just like a quarter mile, which is nothing. And then they go here to Katona. There's another little quarter mile at Katona. They go to the Cross River. Or they could go to Bedford, and right in the middle of town in Bedford, right at the church, was it St. Patrick's or St. somebody, right in front of the church? Got a little portage there right along Main Street. So people would carry their canoes right at what was now Main Street, between the Mayanas River, and then between that and this part of the Mayanas River, and over to these Katona areas. And then there's another little portage to this Mayanas watershed, and then to the Atlantic. So they go different places. So I want to show you the most exciting thing. As you look at these dotted green lines, this is a ridge that defines the edge of a watershed, right? And this is a ridge that defines the edge of a watershed, and it crosses it, which is, it happens, but it's unusual. And then you get, this is the extension of it. So you have these two major ridges crossing right in Mount Kisco, and that's Mount Kisco itself, is like the ridges cross. So what happens is very unusual, and that any waterway on this quadrant would go to the Hudson, and any waterway in this quadrant would go to the Bronx River, and therefore to Clarkson's Point in the East River. And Snackapins, there was many names for this Clarkson's Point factory, which is very important. Had 60 longhouses, people just making wampum, because it's very labor intensive. So it goes to the Bronx River and then to the East River. And then if you get in this part, you get into all this various Mayanas rivers, and there's different parks there now you can visit, but that goes to the Atlantic. And then if you get into this quadrant here, that gets over to Pound Ridge, to Cross River, Wakabuck, and all that part going up to Connecticut. And this is where Lewisboro now is. And there's an interesting spot, and I have a map, and it's not in this program, but Cross River goes all the way to Cross Pond, which is where 4 different tribal territories meet right in this pond. And then there's a big council rock that's still there, and each of these tribes can get to that council rock without crossing anyone else's territory. So if you have a problem, this is what you do. You make your way and you convene at the council rock. But what's really interesting and even more important is that each of these 4 tribes belongs to a different sachendom or nation. So their whole nations can meet without crossing each other's territory. So that's a whole nother fascinating situation, and that's at Cross River or Cross Pond. And that's this way. So this is really, I think, the highlight of all the research I did for the Westpac and for all of Westchester, all of which could be traveled fossil-free today if they really wanted to restore all those rivers. When you look at what waterways and what portages are within 3 miles of Mount Kisco, and it's like all of them, so like here, and then all of these, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one. All those portages and very important ones are inside the 3 mile line from Mount Kisco. That's how important that is. If you go to White Plains and you look at the history signs, it shows you the Revolutionary War and those portages the British were taking. They learned from people like Chief Joseph Brant, who was their ally. He was an officer in their army. And here, of course, Brant knew because his ancestors always took this way, this back way, for the wampum trade. And so I'm sure the British was back here too. They're just learning from the Mohawks. They never named the creeks and rivers after themselves. That would seem really gauche, because we are just passing through, whereas the rivers will stay here forever. And this is a good case to illustrate that, because Gowanus Bay has often been said to have been named after Chief Gowanus, but they wouldn't do that. That makes no sense. First of all, Gowanus, ko is a pine tree or a forest of pines. One is a tributary or a creek, and us means small. So it obviously means a small stream surrounded by beautiful pine trees. But why would the chief call himself that? Well, the chiefs usually name themselves after the waterways, and then the villages often have been named after the waterways already. So we know whether chief first or village first, usually village first. So there must have been a village called Gowanus here, and this beautiful small river surrounded by pines must have been very beautiful. And then, of course, they kicked out the Indians, and then they ruined Gowanus Bay forever, and it's now a bricked-in canal, and it's very polluted. And there's no more pine trees, just like a tree grows in Brooklyn. No, not there, anywhere else. It's still small, but this is a case where you can clearly see the problems that you read almost any source. Oh yeah, named after Chief Gowanus, yeah, we know this. Well, no, it was not. It could not have been. The chief named himself after the land and the village too. So it's still there. We still have the name, and that's it. It shows you several ways of kind of degrading the beauty, not only by destroying the water and the land, but also kind of misappropriating that name and its understanding, because we are just passing
through. So now that we have journeyed through the waterways of southern New York, we are going to take a moment to reflect and celebrate with Evan with an original song.
This song is called Ojiguano, which means morning star in the Anishinaabe language. Anishinaabe is another term for Algonquin, but in Canada. And to think about this man that I knew who taught me, he was adopted me as his grandson, and we worked together 14 years, although he was in Canada. And he was maybe one of the last persons to grow up in the wilderness with no technology basically whatsoever. He was, in order to avoid the residential schools, his uncle's uncle took him to the far woods and left him there for 4 years. And he survived and had to make everything himself and make his own food. And then when he was, that was when he was 12. When he was 16, he kind of emerged from the woods very strong and healthy. And he said, let them try to take me now. Well, he felt that experience really taught him a lot about spirituality and how to be a human being. And so he became a chief, and eventually I studied with him. But he also became a great canoe maker because he had to make all his own canoes in order to get along in uncharted wilderness. And he became what some would call the greatest canoe maker, a birch bark canoe maker. And many of the royalty heads of Europe would commission him for these canoes, so they'd know they had the best. And so I wrote this song for his funeral, and I sang it at the funeral. So in a way, it's a little sad, but in a way, it's very celebratory of the native life. And he really understood this Algonquin way of life that I'm trying to convey through maps. And he liked my maps too. But he helped me write several of my books too, I'm going to say. But he died in, I think, 2011, at almost 100 years old, because he lived. But this is a song about Ojiguano, or William Commanda. And so I'm going to give this a shot so you can get a feel for, this. this ancient way of life, this traditional way of life. I think of you in all the songs we play, and I think of you in all the jokes we made, and I think of you whenever I pray. I say a prayer, my friend, and I think of you. And I think of you when the fiddler strikes a tune, and I think of you when I sing to the moon, and I think of you whenever flowers bloom. I say a prayer, my friend, and I think of you. Oh, Chicano, oh, Chicano, oh, Chicano, oh, beneath the morning star long ago, shine your light from heaven, oh, Chicano, shine your light from heaven now. And I think of you when snow begins to fall, and I think of you when those coyotes howl, and I think of you at every waterfall. I say a prayer, my friend, and I think of you. And I think of you and all the trails we blazed, and I think of you and all the hell we raised, and I think of you, and I still stand amazed to say a prayer, my friend, and I think of you. Oh, Chicano, oh, Chicano, oh, Chicano, born beneath the morning star long ago, shine your light from heaven, oh, Chicano, shine your light from heaven now. And I think of you and all the time we spent, and I think of you and what those words all meant, and I think of all the helping hands you lent. Say a prayer, my friend, and I think of you. And I think about how you grew up on the run, and I think of all the battles you have won, and the rainbow bridge you built to make us one. Say a prayer, my friend, and I think of you. Oh, Chicano, oh, Chicano, oh, Chicano, born beneath the morning star long ago, shine your light from heaven, oh, Chicano, shine your light from heaven now. And I think of you when wolves begin to howl, and I think of you when I'm called by an owl, and when I think I should throw in the towel, I think say a prayer to you, and I think of you. Oh, I think of you when eagles call my name, and I think of you when I think I'm to blame, and when I feel that maybe I've been tamed, I say a prayer, my friend, and I think of you. Oh, Chicano, oh, Chicano, oh, Chicano, born beneath the morning star long ago, shine your light from heaven, oh, Chicano, shine your light from heaven now. And I think of you and why you had to die, and I think of you and I tried not to cry, but if life's a prayer in action, I know why. 'Cause you had your say, my friend, and I'm thanking you. And I think of you and all the trails we blazed, and I think of you and all the hell we raised, and I think of you, and I still stand amazed to say a prayer, my friend, and I think of you. Oh, Chicano, oh, Chicano, he died not so long ago. Shine your light from heaven, oh, Chicano, shine your light from heaven now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you for honoring us with that story and song. Just so people know, that song is available on Evan's CD, The Earth Dance Anthology, which you can also purchase via his website. So that is available, and there are 11 other great songs on that album. So please check it out.